everyone, and welcome to the latest Charity Chats. My name is Catherine Rastomji. I head the charities practice at Shakespeare Martineau, and I'm joined today by my usual co-panellists, Charles Mosquita from Quilter Cheviot and James Saunders from Moore Kingston Smith. It's my turn this time to pick a topic for discussion, and what I've chosen is a speech that Orlando Fraser of the Charity Commission gave this week at Akivo's Festival of Leadership. And I thought there were a number of interesting points that he raised that I would just be interested to hear Charles and James's views on as well. So one of the points that was raised at the start was the following quotation. So earlier this month, CAF, that's Charities Aid Foundation, reported on the findings of a survey of 1,300 charities. Over half of those asked said they fear financial collapse. A year ago, that figure stood at a third. Many are drawing on reserves to meet day-to-day expenditure, and less than a third are confident in their current funding. And so to begin with, Charles, James, I just wondered if that's indicative of the conversations you're having with clients and contacts and your observations.
I think probably yes. I think certainly in my experience auditing at the moment and working with charities on their accounts, I think an awful lot of charities are forecasting for some sort of deficit next year, as we've spoken about previously. That funding is tight. Government funding in particular is tight and getting tighter. And I think this idea of spending, funding from reserves, absolutely. The key with that, of course, is always that as long as you are consciously and deliberately funding from reserves, budgeting from reserves, to spend from reserves, acceptable. It's when things get out of control and you find yourself having to make up gaps from reserves in hindsight, if you like, that we will say that's really the key concern point. But yeah, I think it's probably, I think, we've said before, every month it's a crisis for the charity for the charity sector. Or it seems at the moment there's always another cost of living crisis, or it's perpetual really. I think that's probably a reasonable summary of where we are that Mr. Fraser produced, but I don't think it's quite as in the absolute crisis as was suggested, but certainly very many challenges.
Yeah, I think it does feel like you've sort of been 8 rounds with Mike Tyson, haven't you, with the pandemic, cost of living crisis, and everything else. And I think genuinely people are tired. I think there is, because of the rise in the cost of living. I mean, whether you call it a crisis or a squeeze, people have less disposable income, therefore less money seems to be coming into the sector, and that seems to be coming through in comic relief, the money that's coming in. But I also think I think we need to reset the way that the sector is being funded. I mean, it is just absolutely nuts that chief executives, finance directors, and fundraiser, having spent so much time filling out forms to get 1 year's funding, they're just spending time and money. And then you've got people talking about them. Well, you've got to, justify the amount of money you're raising to the amount you're spending on your cause. And there has got to be more efficient ways to be funding charities. And I just know as a grant funder, we're going through a process at the moment of completely changing the way we're funding, and actually moving, instead of charities applying to us for the funding, is we're actually going to go out, find partners, and then look to set up long-term relationships and say, here is £50,000, £100,000, whatever it may be. You get on and spend it and come back and tell us how you've spent it, so that we can then measure that and reduce the cost of time, of what people are having to do, so they can actually focus on, actually what they're meant to be doing. And it makes me just angry. And I think government also needs to take a leaf out of this book, because procurement has become absolutely, a job in itself.
It's quite stark as well, Charles, isn't it? When you do hear and there are some pockets of unrestricted donating, going on. The Mackenzie Scott Foundation, for example, Silicon Valley Foundation, lots and lots of unrestricted funds being given out in quite big chunks to people. There is a trend. Okay, it's small and but hopefully growing, but it does reflect, I think, that people are starting to hear that, you know, this continual, very prescriptive form filling and registration and reporting regime is so time consuming, and charities can be trusted to do more with unrestricted money. You know, I mean, and that I feel there is a movement that way. And perhaps it's more in the, as Orlando Fraser's speech went on to, the philanthropic sector, rather than the, I mean, perhaps government is a lost cause with the amount of red tape that they have to jump through. Perhaps you know, looking at philanthropic, it's a case of educating that philanthropic sector and saying, you know, let's have unrestricted funds, let's not have too much direction in what you give us.
I think it's interesting, isn't it, because you've both mentioned the philanthropy piece. So let me just give the quote. And the reference that Orlando Fraser made was that we've welcomed the £100 million announced by the Chancellor last week, which I hope will make a difference to local charities, and we can encourage others to dig deep. In that respect, I've made it a personal priority of mine to encourage the wealthiest in our society to give more to charity. The philanthropic culture here in England and Wales lags behind those in comparable countries such as New Zealand and Canada, and far behind what we see in the US. There was once an expectation that those who were very fortunate, either in terms of inheritance, talent or luck, would share the proceeds of that with others who are less fortunate. I find it quite fascinating, and I think, Charles, you mentioned this as well. I'm not quite sure how we came up with the comparable countries of being New Zealand, Canada and the US for a start. But your thoughts, both of you, on the philanthropy debate and whether that's an issue in terms of charitable giving?
I'd be really interested to see what happens in places like Sweden and Finland, where they have the welfare state is extraordinarily strong. I mean, the US, to me, I mean, this is just lazy debate, because the US doesn't have the same welfare state. And there is culturally something very different. It's, you know, I mean, I used to live out there, and it was very much so people would go to dinner parties or wherever, and, you know, they wear it as a badge of honor of who they were supporting and how much money they'd given. And also the tax system is really simple, you know, because it comes straight off gross. We don't have any of this, you know, reclaiming of gift aid, etc. I mean, it probably comes to the same thing, but, you know, I don't know about New Zealand. I think Canada is somewhere between us and the US as a welfare state is concerned. But again, I think it's always dangerous to, I think if people want to give money, that's fine, we should do it. But I think the biggest issue, and sorry, this is a tired record on my part, is actually there is confusion in the general public of where the welfare state stops and charity starts. And until we have that debate, and I know it's not an easy one, and it may be that charity should be fulfilling part of the welfare state, but let's be clear that's what it is, and so that they actually get properly funded. Because at the moment, it just feels like it's everything's a bit sort of, oh, well, we'll go to charities because we can do it on the cheap, and we'll get them to subsidize us instead of actually paying for it properly. I mean, you go to a private company, you could never do that. And of course, we have this sort of schizophrenic relationship about profit or surplus, and that as a sector, we should be, you know, sort of living in impoverished circumstances, and everything should be done hand to mouth. And that, you know, if you want a strong, vibrant sector, for a lot of things that we're delivering, we need to just know who the responsibility is.
Absolutely. I mean, I think if we're going back to old records, mine throughout the lockdown pandemic, when the two of you were the only person I spoke to on these calls, was the NHS is not a charity. I think we had this complete confusion that people went out of their way to support the NHS as though that's the method of funding it, rather than that is something we are taxed on and is paid for from the government. If it needs subsidising, that shouldn't be where charity steps in. But
on the Catherine, on the philanthropic point, if you like, and there was mention later on in the speech about we will not question donations no matter where they come from, and we're going to issue some guidance. And it seemed to be that there was a perception that charities are struggling with or doubting themselves over accepting donations, you know, large ones in some cases. And there seemed to be the suggestion that the charities were worried about the Charity Commission telling them off for accepting money. And I think there was a suggestion that Charity Commission will be issuing some guidance, and there was, we will not question your acceptance of these donations as long as they're done in the right way. I mean, it seemed to me that charities are not worried about the Charity Commission coming down on them for accepting donations. They are enormously worried about public perception and being held in the court of public opinion. This charity has accepted this money, and suddenly it's a news story, factually correct or otherwise. And perhaps that is something that, the government attacks on charity campaigning in recent weeks, and individuals campaigning. I mean, it's excruciating in some ways. This government crusade against disagreement. It's embarrassing, I think. I would say for the government and some of those MPs, but. That's what they're more worried about. The charities are much more worried about getting in the public eye in these donations rather than in the Charity Commission's eye line. And that comes from that's not just that's donations, accepting donations. That's any activity they do, frankly.
No.
Well, I think there are, sorry, I think there are two things here, isn't there? I mean, it's interesting because, funny enough, at one of the trustee boards I sit on, we've had a debate about a £20,000 gift, and I'm afraid I've sat on the basis, and we were worried about our reputation of taking the money from a particular company, and there's a whole lot of due diligence that's been done around it. But actually, my viewpoint was that we have a duty to take it on behalf of our beneficiaries, that if we didn't take it, they're going to lose out the benefit. So there's got to be a real reason not to do so. And actually, we're not here to judge the company itself, but we can handle how they use us, to do it. But there is a transaction here because they're giving us money and they're going to want something in return for that, whatever that may be. And I think the other thing is that the Charity Commission needs to be possibly a little bit more robust or careful about the way it responds when you do get the court of public opinion turning against a charity, and not necessarily doing it, in fact, more often than not, knowing exactly what the facts were. Because I remember LSE and Gaddafi giving money, but I can't tell you when he gave it and whether Gaddafi at the time was in favour or out of favour. I suspect, he was seen as fine and politically was okay, and the government was happy to deal with him. But then, of course, he became persona non grata, and the grant became then persona non grata for them, and they had to deal with it. But these things are not easy. But half the time, I think that the regulator just needs to be very careful about not adding fuel to the flame. By making comments which, perfectly sensible comments, but then are misunderstood as criticism of the charity rather than general observations about what charities should do.
Absolutely agree. And I think maybe that's our call to arms for the regulator, actually, is to stand alongside charities and to educate others about what does charity law require? Is this charity compliant? There's nothing to see here. I think that's the sort of response that we don't often see. I think it's more just reactive and letting those emotions run away with it. So I think you've both stayed very calm for today's chat, though. So well done, both of you, not to, lose your plot on this. So that's the end of our session today. I look forward to seeing the next one and whichever topic James or Charles comes up with. But thank you for joining us today. We'd welcome any comments, disagreements, feedback, suggestions for other topics we could talk about. Would be good to hear from you. But thank you for joining us.